Christian, welcome.
Stefan.
Great to have you. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I took the executive MBA at DTU and graduated in 2020, shortly after the Corona lockdown. I think we just had the chance to graduate, and then actually I think the world locked down again in Corona. But I work now in the Nykredit Asset Management, which is one of the largest asset management companies in Denmark, and I work as an ESG senior specialist. So this is a trend or a field in finance that is moving very rapidly, that you evaluate and screen investments using environment, social and governance factors. I've also worked in the Ministry for Environment, so I have a profile in water and waste and other types of substance areas within the environment. And I also worked as a lobbyist for the World Wildlife Fund in Denmark on EU agricultural policy. And then my first real job was as a UN negotiator in the Ministry for Climate and Energy, when Denmark had the, probably to many Danes, well-known Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, which was seen as a bit of a failure or a huge failure.
Maybe we should start with the last part that you mentioned, those climate negotiations, the COP15. I was wondering, in hindsight, what have you seen working really well, and what have you seen not working well? What are some of those lessons you drew from that experience?
Yeah, I was very young, and it was one of my first jobs, and I was only 27 when we started. But there was a good mix in that team. We were around 30 people in the UN negotiations team for Denmark, working out of Copenhagen. We also had some climate attachés that were sitting in the US, some sitting in Brazil, Russia. And it was a very international job, a very global job, even though we were sitting here in Denmark. And this mix of being young, energetic, and out of graduate school, and you really wanted to change the world and use your skill set. And then you had a mentor, I remember having a mentor, his name was Jesper. I had a team leader whose name was Christian, and we had a very inspiring head of department or head of division, Thomas Becker. And I think there was a lot of support for us that were young and energetic. We were asked to work quite hard, which we did. But there was a lot of enthusiasm and support for us. They gave us a belief that you can do really well with this task. You don't just go to New Zealand and give us the lessons learned of this workshop, or we trust that you can write a great speech for the minister. Please go and do this and draft some speeches for Connie Hedegaard. And this kind of psychological support, I don't think it's psychological safety necessarily, but it's important when you're young that someone believes in you, that you can do really well with the task, because then if you're young, then you really also believe it yourself. And I might, something maybe for the psychologist, have a bit of a self-criticism and a tendency to maybe be a little bit harsh on myself, because I have very high performance standards. And I remember that the superiors and the team leaders were very good in encouraging us. So I think that's important.
So you were 27 and you found yourself thrusted in the limelight of the main world event in that year, pretty much in 2009, right?
Yeah.
Obama was just fresh in office.
Exactly.
Clinton, as Secretary of State.
That's right.
There was hope that finally the US was coming back to the table.
Exactly.
And then?
The US, there was a Waxman-Markey bill in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, which was supposed to give the US some binding legislation. And that would then, become a credible negotiating leverage, so to say, in the negotiations. And then China, Brazil, Russia, India could see that the Americans were ready, but the bill didn't pass. So Obama came, but he didn't have, a lot to show, some people would say. So we ended up with my kind of like a soft landing, which was considered not very strong. But in hindsight, much of the Paris Agreement in 2015 built on the Copenhagen Accord and the Copenhagen deal. And I think this, our Prime Minister back then, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, who's today the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Denmark, he believed that this political deal and getting 135 prime ministers and heads of state to Denmark, to Copenhagen, would somehow push forward this climate agenda. And I think he was very right in that. As a young person, I was sitting in the chair, the Danish chair, and I remember seeing Mugabe from Zimbabwe, Chavez from Venezuela, Obama, all these very famous heads of state. And I was, I remember being 5 meters from, or 2 meters from Obama, and also Iran's president, I don't know. Ahmadinejad.
Ahmadinejad. Yeah.
So these were some villains, and you had some heroes. But in the end, in the UN, you need to have unanimity, and there was 5 to 7 states that were really being difficult, and then we couldn't get a unanimous deal.
So that's a beautiful example of a failure that was really close to success, but eventually collapsed.
Yeah.
That, as you said, paved the ground for further success.
That's right.
But I'm wondering, how did you experience that? Being young, having worked so hard for it, being so close, and then at that point, at least, you didn't know the success would come years later in Paris.
Yeah, I think that you're very right. I was very disappointed. And also my family and my girlfriend's family were asking, you spent all this time on this event and now it's a complete failure. How do you feel about that? Or are you responsible, or who's responsible? And it was tormenting. It was really tough. And I think we didn't have maybe the tools, or we're not given the tools actually to bounce back from that. So I was actually feeling a bit sad for some months, but then we quickly had to work again on some new things.
But what I learned from what you are saying now is how leadership doesn't stop with the end of a task.
No.
Right? It continues, because whatever happens, the outcome of that big task or big endeavor lives within people afterwards, for good or bad.
You're right. And it's interesting that many of those that were in the negotiating team have been working on climate change in the Danish government, or in embassies, or in different capacities. Some of the people from the Prime Minister's office, I see one of them has been working on climate change, and I see many of them being somehow working on it. And there's a green think tank where I called Concito, and my former team leader is the director of that, and Connie Hedegaard has been on the board for that. So I mean, people are still pushing, because this is a generational challenge. It might even be, this century challenge or beyond, because temperatures are still rising. And we're very concerned also where I sit in the financial sector.
So that's the next topic, which is sustainability, right?
Yes.
So you've made that transition from the public sector to private sector, but still working on sustainability.
Yes.
So
a year ago,
your diagnosis, where are we at now?
Where we are now?
Yeah.
We are in a world where many of the elements from the Copenhagen deal and the Paris Agreement, such as having a net zero strategy, having net zero ambitions for 2050, having a trajectory down towards net zero, and where we should be if we want to be in a 1.5 degrees world, I see company after company after company being ready with these net zero strategies. But I think us, as being professional investors in Nykredit Asset Management, from the business side, we want to see short-term targets, 2025, 2030 targets, and we want to see credible low-carbon transition plans. Because it's quite easy for a business board or for a CEO to have a long-term plan 30 years out. but that it needs to have some credible capex investment. It needs to have some credible, maybe even at the board level, you need some competencies to drive governance at the board level. So we're looking for several different things to back up some of these ambitions from the companies.
So the role of finance here is that you challenge, or investment is that you challenge companies to be more aggressive, because you see them one after the other being ready to embrace those objectives set by the government for 2050.
That's right.
But as investor, you want them to go faster and bigger.
Yeah, faster and be credible. And actually put some money behind. Just to give an example, we've talked a lot about hard to abate industries. So that could be cement, steel, aluminum. It could be shipping like Maersk, etc. It could be airlines. Some sectors drive a lot of the emissions. In Denmark, we have Maersk, and they have a large fleet of container ships. And we have seen that they've invested in somewhere between 13 to 18 large methanol ships. And I think seen from a business point of view, we need these role models, we need these examples. And the company I work in, we have been part of this investor dialogue, pushing Maersk as part of what is called Climate Action 100 Plus, where we engage with the largest companies on climate change.
And in that sense, you're able to marry superior returns with the values and the impact you want to have.
That's right. There is a lot of studies done by academics on these ESG factors. So if you look at a company, if you look at a portfolio of 50 companies, and you screen for ESG risks, environment, social, and governance risks, and then if there are some clear red flags, then you eliminate those companies from your portfolio if they are breaching norms, or if they have toxic emissions, dumping toxic waste in the river. We don't want none of that.
So that's negative screening.
It could be negative screening. This is called exclusions.
Exclusions.
Yeah. And there's a big debate in finance the whole last year. Should we exclude or should we engage? And Nykredit does a lot of engagements. So we have engagements on various topics where we try to, in the dialogue, push the companies. This is also leadership, but it's called stewardship. Or active ownership. And I think the role of finance is very important. And that's why I also went from the government into finance, because I was a bit maybe disappointed with, when you sit in the government, that we have quite small budgets. We have a lot of influence, but we don't have a lot of money to spend on projects. And here we get to move very large amounts of capital in the right direction.
How do you continue and pursue that thought leadership?
Yeah, so in my job, I write 5 to 7 pages, analyses of 5 to 7 pages. They are called issue briefs on different topics in sustainability. And I have been working on some projects that started back in the lockdown period, because restaurants were closed and there was no entertainment. And I had a desire to write more. So I have been working on a book which I hope can come out soon. And this is about conglomerates, and it's about different types of conglomerates. So investment companies and serial acquirers, and more traditional industrial conglomerates. And I'm asking a question, whether it is a superior strategy to be a conglomerate in the modern age, because it was seen as a very strong business strategy in the 1960s. And now we see companies like Alphabet, and we see companies like Tencent Holdings acquiring a lot of companies through perhaps a venture arm such as Google Ventures, or Tencent Holdings have been acquiring a lot of online gaming companies throughout the world. And so we see these diversified giants becoming really large players. And I've been studying, what has been their corporate strategies, what are their acquisitions, and because I'm an investor, I'm interested in whether it's a good strategy for investors. And the book will be called Conglomerate Empires, and I hope it will be out this year or in 2024.
What do you think of when you look at the future?
What I'm seen from an ESG point of view, it's biodiversity. It's the loss of biodiversity, and that's definitely something I worked a lot on. And that will influence the food and agriculture sector. It will influence certain value chains because you might see crop losses, crop yield declines, etc. But if you look at a more general purpose technology that will influence businesses across the board, for me, there's no doubt that the single most important thing the next 10, 20 years is the rise of artificial intelligence.
Okay,
and
so we are two mega trends.
Yeah, and I think artificial intelligence will be something that every single company will have to address, having a strategy, finding out how can you use this technology in a proprietary way to perhaps upload data sets in the cloud, and then some AI data mining, deep mind technology can generate insights. It's a very powerful trend that we see now.
Christian, I know you mentioned how important it was years ago when you had a very, very challenging, very, very influential mission for quite a while. You mentioned how important it was to have supportive leadership. What did you specifically experience when you had this support from leadership? Do you remember that? What did she actually do to be supportive?
Yeah, I remember that. The team leader I had was also. He told us that he was also a football coach or a badminton coach or something like that. And I think he has been one of the few leaders I've had that has been using these types of techniques or ways of leading, where you use maybe this more optimistic, direct coaching that you find perhaps on the football pitch.
Specific feedback?
Yeah, specific feedback, but more importantly, it's saying like, I know you can do it. There's not a single task that you cannot do. We want to see your brain in action, or something like that. Like, it was giving me a very high reputation that I had to live up to, but not in a negative way.
No, it sounds like it was a basic sense of being trusted.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And then I think that it's when you're young and it's your first job, then you want to live up to that trust or that high reputation that you're given.
Yeah.
And then you go a bit extra.
Trust is motivational. Having a direction, a clear picture, nicely expressed, is motivating. What could demotivate you?
I think in some sense, if you work in a very specialized organization like I do, where you have teams, you have a bond team, or you have an alternatives team, or you have a value equity team or a focus equity team, where you have different strategies and people are sitting a bit in silos. And what can demotivate me sometimes is maybe the lack of transparency, or the lack of sharing of knowledge. Some people hate receiving a lot of messages and a lot of emails about what goes on in the organization, but actually I really think it's important. So I would like to have more of that, to feel that I'm included in the discussions. But it might be seen as a bit inefficient. But
waste of time somehow?
Yeah, I think that some organizations are very focused on, that value creation happens in the teams. But I tend to believe that there's also, strong value creation between teams.
It's easy to notice the passion you have about having the possibility to influence key issues in society. You're very passionate about it, and it seems to be very important for you. It also comes across to me that your approach is you are analytical and you have a strategic perspective. You see the bigger picture and you see how it moves and doesn't move. And you like to be in a situation and in a context where there are influential power.
And I think I have also learned that internal stakeholders and managing internal stakeholders is more important than I actually thought. And I need to work more on that. I've been very much focused on external stakeholders, and this can be both a psychological thing that I feel better at work at connecting sometimes with strangers than working closely with colleagues.
And I'm really pleased that you're so honest about that, because that was my if I should highlight a pitfall in you being very passionate about influencing, I was asking myself while I was listening, do you remember to show the person, the human behind this very professional, analytical, strategic, influential focus? Because how does people connect? It does by being transparent, by also showing not necessarily, of course, not private issues, but more personal aspects, not only the professional influential part, but also the more personal. So I was wondering if you remember to be careful and aware how to create followership by sharing also thoughts behind actions, doubts, issues with other people, and taking lead on that, as well as taking lead on being visible. You were smiling just now.
Yeah, I think as always, you are a very astute observer and a very experienced coach. I think you're spot on. I probably need to be better at that, and feeling safe doing it, and knowing that that will not necessarily detract from me but
actually the opposite.
But I think that it's also a bit, what is the culture like in that workplace? But of course, we should be doing it if it is increasingly, if we feel better, and also if we also efficient.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
Yeah,
that's the point. Okay, thanks a lot.